Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Steve Stearns, who's a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at Yale University. Professor Stearns specializes in life history evolution, which links the fields of ecology and evolutionary biology and in evolutionary medicine. Welcome, Steve.
Hello.
I want to start with one of your older papers to set the context for our conversation. So this one is entitled Life History Evolution, Successes, Limitations, and Prospects, in which you say life history theory tries to explain how evolution designs organisms to achieve reproductive success. So what do you mean by life history?
Well, a life history in its classical sense consists of the individual expression of the major demographic parameters. Basically, it's about birth and death, but that has components. And so it analyzes the evolution of those components. How old are you when you first reproduce? How large a baby do you have? How many babies do you have? How many times do you reproduce in your lifetime? How long is the interval between your reproductive attempts, and how long do you live?
Okay. So those parameters have changed over time. And there's some hypotheses as to why that's the case and what is really affecting that, right?
Yes, and just let me ask you back. Do you mean changed over time within the human lineage, or do you mean changed over time in evolution in general?
So I guess the focus could be the human lineage, because that is what's going to take us forward to some of the other disease areas that we want to talk about, right?
Sure.
And so how has it changed, from a human evolutionary perspective? So what would you consider humans' timelines, like 50,000 years?
Well, I think modern humans have been around for probably about 250 or 300,000 years, and I suspect that our life histories were not that different from Neanderthal. So it goes back closer to 1 million years probably. But in terms of what causes changes in life history traits, it's primarily shifts in the age-specific rates of birth and death. So if an environment becomes, say, riskier and more likely to kill adults, then the age at maturity will decline. Because there's no point in trying to live longer if something else is going to kill you anyway.
Right.
You might as well take whatever you're going to invest in maintenance and put it into reproduction earlier in life.
Yeah, so the objective function is purely reproduction. That at least that is the assumption here, right?
If we focus on evolution from the point of view of an individual organism, yes. It gets a bit more complex if you try to put yourself into the shoes of a gene. because genes then can also exist in the bodies of relatives. And then you have to think about the individual's actions on its relatives as well as its own. But if we just start from the point of view of just the individual, then yes, the objective function, by which you mean what would natural selection optimize, is expected lifetime reproductive success. Numbers of babies produced at the end of your life, and even better, number of those babies that survive themselves to reproduce. So it's not only their number, but their quality.
Right. So do we have sufficient data to look at sort of the evolution extending to the group and how that is changing things?
Well, we certainly have good evidence on that from things like social insects and from other socially organized organisms. In terms of humans, I think that selection on the group is complicated by the fact that we have culture. And that means that we can also have cultural group selection. In other words, there could be group norms that spread within a group that say that individuals should sacrifice their own interests to promote the interests of the group. And those group norms could be cemented in place by punitive action. So if an individual notices another individual defecting from a group norm, they could step up and punish them for doing that. Now, of course, they would then pay the cost of that punishment because the person being punished would get irritated. And so there actually has been interesting analyses of these sorts of dynamics. And in humans, it does appear that something like selection within a group to promote norms that are directed at the benefit of the whole group rather than just the benefit of the individual can occur, and in fact probably have occurred.
So that's very interesting. So the society's objective function could essentially drive evolution in the group. I would imagine similar things are happening in ants and bees and things like that, or no?
Yes, they are. And in fact, ants and bees are farther along that path than we are. So when we refer to a eusocial insect, it means that you can think of the colony, the entire colony, with all of its various castes and workers, with a queen at the center of it, who is actually the reproductive organ. You can think of that almost as being a new kind of organism at a higher level of organization. And we haven't achieved that. And I think that there are many people who would object strenuously to having that happen to us.
But in some societies, we might be quite close.
It might be, and if you look across the globe, there is variation in the degree to which societies honor group interest over individual interest. There's no question about that. But I think that there's still considerable tension in humans between those two levels.
Yeah. If you take it to more of a micro level, do we have such things happening, let's say, in the microbiome or anything like that?
Well, I think it is certainly true that we are adapted to our microbiome and our microbiome is adapted to us. But that is a looser kind of a connection. If we take it to the micro level just inside of our own bodies, we can say that yes, our own bodies, which are multicellular, represent a new level of organization. But of course, multicellularity is ancient and it's shared with all multicellular eukaryotes. So that goes back probably 1.5 billion years, roughly. But if you think about it from the point of view of that first cell that decided that it was going to be part of a multicellular organism, and then found itself existing in a multicellular organism, and then was being asked to relinquish its interest in reproducing in order to support the reproductive possibilities of those other cells that are going off in the gonads and making gametes and getting to get into the next generation. I think if you can put yourself in the shoes of that cell, you can see that, well, we are actually the product of one of these major evolutionary transitions. We ourselves are a higher level of organization. But boy, it took a long time to do that.
Right. Yeah. So would it be correct in saying that at the micro level, it seems to happen more naturally as the participants get more complex, then it takes a lot longer?
No, I don't think I would say that. If you think back in the
Mm,
evolution of life, from the origin of life to the first cell, that was already the first major transition, and that appears actually to have gone, quote, relatively rapidly. Might have happened in less than 300 million years.
yeah, yeah, right.
And then when you get that first cell, and it's a bacterial cell and it doesn't yet have organelles in it, well, they're around for probably about 1 or 2 billion years before
Mm,
a mitochondrion enters the cell line that led to us, and you get organelles. You get a nucleus, you get a mitochondrion, and you get a complex cell. That's another major transition.
mm,
And then to go from that into a multicellular organism, well, you wait around probably for another 500 or million or a billion years.
right.
Once you get multicellular organisms, things then explode, but they don't explode in the sense of going through another major evolutionary transition. They explode in the sense of making, oh my goodness, now we have all these different kinds of organisms,
Mm,
but they're all essentially at the same basic level of organization. They're all multicellular organisms. Then,
mm.
after probably, maybe 300 or 400 million years, you get to eusocial insects. So you get ants and bees and things like that. And that is another major transition. And I would say
Okay.
that the next one is happening in us, and it probably is signaled by the invention of language. And
Mm.
that gives a different, then you have a different form of information transmission, and that really changes the evolutionary dynamic fundamentally.
Okay, okay. So it's almost the other way around. So cooperation and sacrifice for groups' benefits and actions like that, we can actually see that in complex organisms developing those traits a lot faster
Yes, yes.
in very short periods of time. You have an essay related to this, and you ask, are we stalled partway through a major evolutionary transition from individual to group? Do you want to talk a bit about what you're talking about there?
Well, I'll tell you how that came about. I had been
Yeah,
doing a fair amount of reading in cultural anthropology and evolutionary psychology. I was rather dissatisfied with the quality of the science that was supporting the claims. Those are not areas in which one can do experimental tests, and the both areas were fairly rife with speculation.
right.
So I spent a year's sabbatical that I got in 2005, 2006, reading widely in those areas and trying to pull something out of them that I thought might be an idea that could push that area forward. And it's captured in the title of that paper, Are We Stuck in a Major Evolutionary Transition?
Mm,
And what I tried to express in that is that humans have been living inside a situation of hierarchical selection for a long time. By
yeah,
that I mean that when we were in hunter-gatherer groups, we were all fairly closely related to the other individuals in our groups. And that
right.
meant that the more or less classical evolutionary genetic mechanisms of kin selection could operate, which would mean that you would be cooperative with kin even if it cost you something, because you would
Mm,
be benefiting the reproduction of your kin more than you would be costing yourself reproductive success.
right.
And that within a small group, you're very closely related to most other organisms, most of the other
Mm,
human individuals in the group. Um, and within that context, then, that could also promote through a kind of interaction between cultural and genetic evolution, the kind of psychology, the genetic basis for the kind of psychology that would support norms of cooperation and altruism and helping others
mm,
beyond the bounds of the immediate family and beyond the reach necessarily of just genetic relationship. And
right.
then once we translated ourselves into a larger context, we went through the agricultural revolution, we started living in cities, we brought
Mm,
into that new sort of human ecology that historical legacy of psychological and genetically supported reactions that would tend to promote a certain degree of cooperation and altruism. So that's part of the story. But against that, we have to remember one of the take-home lessons of 20th century evolutionary genetics is that anytime you try to set up some sort of cooperative stability, there is always going to be the possibility that a selfish mutant will invade and will destabilize that.
Right, right, yeah.
And I think that what we have seen in our history is that repeated attempts to become more cooperative, repeatedly subverted by selfishness. And it's not that one is going to win out over the other. I think that this is an ongoing tension. I see it. Having had that insight, of course, I did what is often the psychological reaction of people who have some insight that they think explains something, and they don't always do, of course. But I began to see that everywhere I looked.
Right, right. Yeah. It's so interesting. And so as you say, in hunter-gatherer societies, it was quite easy. It was small groups. They were fairly closely related. And so the noise was much lower. And when agriculture happened, societies developed. In a modern context, I see the same thing, Steve, in organizations. I wrote a book in 2009 called Flexibility, and you can see sort of the similar thing going on in organizations, right? So there you have it's not genetic relationship, but you have self-selection bias, you have hiring patterns in place, and you're trying to assemble a group of people who sort of think alike, act alike, and like each other, which might be okay from a group dynamics perspective, but can be shown to be not optimum for the organization's success.
I see. So in addition to all of those nice things, you mean you need some degree of internal competition to keep people on their toes and to keep shareholder value growing?
Partly that, and partly I call it flexibility, which is also come from sort of group diversity. And so because organizations are really, they get into shocks, right? When a shock happens, when you have a uniform structure, that entity is unlikely to survive. Entities that have high diversity and high flexibility are more likely to survive in a shock. But that sort of goes counter to what we see in sort of small human organizations, right? Before we get into organizations, big
I see.
organizations.
Interesting. So what you're telling me is that the cultural evolution of organizations leads in many cases to evolutionary dead ends because they become uh, less flexible. They get very good at doing one thing and they become less good at reacting to many things.
That's right. That's right. And it might be interesting to think about if that is sort of an unavoidable outcome. And so, we've been around for 100,000 years, maybe close to 1,000,000 years. All of our instincts have been shaped by a very long period of time, and just in the last 5,000 years, we have different things to do. So we are attempting to do things that are sort of counter to our instincts from an evolutionary perspective.
Yes. And I think one of the most difficult things that we have to do now is to be able to see consequences in the long term and at
Yeah.
higher levels of organization than our immediate family. It's difficult for each of us to realize that whatever actions we take, if everyone took them, would add up into something like global change. It's difficult
Right.
for us to see that if I personally don't want to get vaccinated, that I might be creating a level of risk at the population for some unvaccinated child. And I think that difficulty is built into our psychology. I think that we were shaped by evolution to be short-term individual fitness maximizers. And I think that has left us with minds that are not as capable of grasping the consequences of impacts that we're now having as we have achieved global domination and technological breakthroughs. So our minds are not shaped to deal with population consequences of individual decisions.
Yeah. So this gets really complex. So I understand, are we stalled partway through a major evolutionary transition from individual to group? So would you say, Steve, this is sort of, sometimes I think of this as sort of the next level society. I think of this sort of a step function change. So either we're going to perish in sort of a level zero society, or we're going to pull ourselves up into a next level where all our behaviors, all of our instincts and evolutionary forces are all going to be different from sort of the level zero society. Do you see it sort of a step function change?
Well, I would like to believe it. I myself am a political progressive, and it would be lovely if we could transform ourselves in a step function into a society that could actually intelligently manage global warming and could intelligently manage income inequality and could intelligently manage an equitable distribution of educational opportunity. I would, be all for that. But I think that there's a fundamental problem here with differences in rates, ratios of rates. Cultural evolution can be very rapid, but biological evolution responds more slowly. And to the degree that our responses of selfishness are biologically rooted, and I think many of them are, it is going to be difficult to avoid the problem that when we try to achieve these cultural transitions, we're inevitably going to be met with a lot of individuals who are expressing selfish interest and resisting it.
Right. And it doesn't require too many individuals to be selfish for the system to fail, like you said, right? It just takes a
Well,
few.
especially if one of them is a leader.
We won't go there. And so we can actually look at more technically how this is affecting us. So one of your recent papers entitled "The Transition to Modernity and Chronic Disease: Mismatch and Natural Selection." You say the Industrial Revolution and the accompanying nutritional, epidemiological, and demographic transitions have profoundly changed human ecology and biology, leading to major shifts in life history traits, which include age and size and fertility and lifespan, as you mentioned before. And so now we are in a situation that things are moving really fast, and all the evolutionary things that used to happen in much slower pace, that used to sort of optimize the system, seems to act counter to what might be optimum, right? So what do we see here from a disease perspective?
Well, here's the basic idea. Back in the day, before we went through these transitions, let us suppose that natural selection had in fact optimized our level of reproduction and our investment in maintenance, and therefore roughly our lifespan. Natural selection doesn't really operate directly on lifespan. It operates on reproductive success, but lifespan results as a byproduct of whatever trade-offs are occurring with reproductive success and maintenance. Okay, so then we go through this transition, and one of the big ecological changes in the transition is that because of clean water, because of the built environment, because of improvements in nutrition, because of antibiotics, and because of vaccines, my goodness, suddenly a lot of us are living a lot longer, right?
Right.
And what that does is it exposes in this great new population of older people all the consequences of those trade-offs that were made back in the day that didn't have to be paid at that time because we never lived long enough to pay them. And by that I mean that if in our evolution we had been willing to pay a cost in terms of risk of cancer or heart disease or Alzheimer's in order to have better reproduction when we were young, that wouldn't have cost us very much because, hey, we were going to die of infectious disease or of predators or something like that anyway. But now that we have
Yeah.
become the dominant species on the planet, and we have got antibiotics and vaccines and modern medicine and all of that. Many of us are living to an older age, and now we see in those older people the evolutionary legacy of those trade-offs. They're now being expressed in people who are over the age of 60 or 70. And if we go in and we analyze what are the actions, say, of the genes that increase the risk of coronary artery disease, there are about 70 of them. Well, the top 40 of those genes are all doing something else earlier in life. They're all doing something to either promote reproduction or improve survival in the young, but they do it in ways that have this byproduct of creating a cost in the old. And so that's one of the big meanings of mismatch. Natural selection hasn't had time to kind of catch up with this process and rearrange our genomes so that we don't have to pay such high costs at older ages.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. So if you, from an optimization perspective, you said you have a hard constraint, nothing is going to go beyond 35. You optimize the system within that constraint, and then suddenly you remove the constraint. All the genes that were doing something within that constraint are now creating essentially problems. So that is what you call, what is the right term for that, Steve? Antagonistic
Let me break down antagonistic pleiotropy for you.
Yeah.
Pleiotropy is a technical term in genetics. It simply means one gene does two or more things, okay? And antagonistic means that the things that it does are antagonistic to each other in that one of them increases fitness and the other one decreases fitness, by which we mean one of them increases lifetime reproductive success and the other decreases it. So here, let me give you one striking example.
Yeah.
There are genes which promote the implantation of the blastocyst into the endometrium. Now, the blastocyst is the tiny little early human that has just been fertilized. It's a little ball of cells. It comes floating down the fallopian tube into the uterus. There ahead of it is this lovely endometrium, and it has to implant in that endometrium. This is a risky step because the blastocyst needs to convince the mother that it is not a pathogen, and the mother needs to accept that, and then the blastocyst needs to undergo a process of burrowing into the endometrium, and cells actually have to move into the maternal cells. It's a complex process. It digs itself in. So there are genes that improve that. Well, it turns out that those are genes that later in life are the same genes that are used by metastatic cancer cells, because guess what? They can move through tissue. They can remodel blood vessels. They can do all these important things that are very good for metastatic cancer. But in fact, every cell in our body has that genetic program because we used it when we were very, very early in life and trying to implant into our mother's endometrium so that we could form a placenta. And that's a remarkably strong trade-off between something that's very important for reproduction that happens extremely early in life and something that is detrimental to survival but happens 50 or 60 years later.
Right. And for most of our history, we didn't have to worry about it because we never reached an age where that became a problem. And so there are a lot of examples. So you say here something related. So growing evidence suggests that the rates and sizes of recent phenotypic responses to mismatch can substantially alter the direction and intensity of natural selection for genes and contribute to important traits such as age and size at first birth, body mass index, and age of menopause. And so again, all of these appear to be finely tuned for some period of time, but all of them create problems once you go beyond.
Yes, I think it's really remarkable that when we first came up with some of those ideas, they were purely theoretical. That was back in, let's say, between 1981 and 1986, and it was just consequences of mathematics that those things would happen. But then, when we analyzed the human population in Framingham, Massachusetts, and we looked at all of the relationships between lifetime reproductive success and age at first reproduction, number of body mass index, age at menopause, things like that, we got the results that you just quoted. So we saw that natural selection was operating on the people of Framingham, Massachusetts between, say, 1900 and 1970. And that essentially what was going on is that women were being selected to have their first child earlier and to do so when they were a bit chubbier. So their body mass index was changing and their first child was arriving earlier in life. There were some other very interesting patterns in there. One was that women who had 1 or 2 children lived longer, but women who had 3 or more children lived shorter, such that if you had your 3rd child would take a year off your life, your 4th child would take another year off your life, and your 5th child would take another year off your life. But the first 2 actually extended lifespan. And that probably has something to do with the fact that having some children reduces the risk of reproductive cancers, but having a lot of children wears you out physiologically.
Yeah. I think that is seen in the data in a lot of different types of cancer, I think. But 1900 to 1970, that is a very short period of time, right? To actually
Oh,
observe sort of an
yeah. Well, let
evolution.
me
Yeah.
let me point out that what we claimed in that paper was not that we had seen a response to selection. We said we have quantified selection. That means that we
Ah,
showed that there were strong correlations between the kinds of changes and traits that I just described and the number of
yeah.
offspring that women were having. There's another study that was done in Quebec on an island in the St. Lawrence River, in
Yeah.
which they were able to follow from church records the life histories of a fairly inbred, isolated group of human beings that came over and settled on this island as farmers from 1750 up until quite recently. So they had more than 200 years of information, and they had the genealogies, so they knew who married whom. And from the genealogies, they could make estimates of the genetic component of the changes. And they were able to
Yeah.
document a very plausible genetic shift in age at first reproduction. So that, together with the fact that other studies in other countries, such as the UK, Sweden, and Australia, have all shown that post-transitional societies are generating natural selection for an earlier age at first birth, leads me to conclude it may be a fairly general result.
Yeah, and very short. Shorter than expected sort of horizons from an evolutionary perspective. And so the demographic transition that you talk about here, you said unprecedented change from regime of high fertility and high mortality to one of low fertility and low mortality. So it is a sudden shock to the human system. But some of the cases that you mentioned, they seem to catch up with it reasonably fast. Is that a conclusion, or it's too early to say?
Well, I think that one thing that we have to bring into this conversation is the fact that life histories in general, and human life histories in particular, are plastic. And by that I mean that one genotype can produce different kinds of organisms just depending on the kind of environment that it encounters. So,
Yeah,
and this is part of the flexibility that you were talking about earlier. So if,
right.
for example, we go through a demographic transition, and what happens in that transition is that suddenly our mortality rates are much lower, and our nutrition is better, and our offspring mortality rates are much lower, and we have culture and we have consciousness, then it is pretty straightforward to say that we're going to decrease the number of babies that we have, and we're going to invest more in a few high quality offspring rather than in many low quality offspring. Well, we have the resources to do it. We have the nutrition to do it. We have the protection of vaccines and antibiotics, and of course, as culture continues, we also have other things that we want to do.
Right, right. And so that kind of explains that the growth rate is slowing, or is expected to slow, I believe, post 2040. And the human population is expected to peak around 2100. And so they predict that we are never going to go past 9.5
Yeah,
billion or something like that.
we should remind
We,
people who are
yeah,
listening in on this conversation that in many countries in Western Europe and in Japan, that we are already below
yeah,
replacement rate, right? So,
right. Which is supposed to
yeah,
be like 2.1
2.1
or something like that.
children per
Yeah,
lifetime
yeah,
would be replacement rate.
right. And we are down to, I think, 1.7 or so in Western Europe and maybe even less in Japan. The only reason we are seeing this population grow is really supported by a few countries, right? And once they slow down, I think that the whole population growth is going to slow. And so if you think about the way that you framed it, which is, humanity has sort of an investment optimization problem. They're going to live longer. They don't need as many kids. That gives them some luxury of extra time, so they can actually create, perhaps, let's call it, better kids. So is that the optimization path that humanity is on?
Yeah, I think we've already done quite a bit of that. Certainly in the developed
Yeah.
countries, I think that that is a cultural choice that many people have made. As for the problem of population growth, it is difficult to achieve, but I think the one thing that would most rapidly slow the growth of the human population is to give every woman on the planet control over her own body. And that is going to run into very strong cultural resistance in a number of places around the world. But in fact, I mentioned this to a colleague of mine at Yale who teaches a course on populations, and he mentioned that something like that had actually been carried out. I think it was in Colombia. The government actually imposed a law which, in effect, did give women control over their own bodies, and the birth rate dropped from about 3.5 or 4 down right to what, 2.
Yeah, I mean, but that is one attribute. The other attribute is simply education, Steve. I grew up in southwestern part of India, and in that small state in the 50s and 60s, yeah, we were close to zero growth rate, and it was 100% literate, and it had some unusual characteristics around that. But just education in itself has very high negative correlation
Yes.
with
Oh,
birth rate.
I
Yeah.
completely agree. I think that but you know, one of the ways that you do give women control over their own bodies is by educating them.
You got to educate everybody else. You got to educate the guys,
Yeah,
actually.
yeah, I agree with that. So was that in Kerala? Where were you?
That was in
Yeah,
Kerala. Yeah.
yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah. And so I just want to revisit, sort of the pleiotropy that you described. And so we have set of non-communicable diseases now in this aging population. And so we probably have an idea or hypothesis why that's happening. Does that allow us to think about treatment modalities or interventions in any way?
Well, it is certainly one of the things that people who are enchanted with CRISPR-Cas think about, and they think that, well, perhaps if we really understand the genetic reasons for disease risk in old age, we can repair that. And then you get into a couple of conundrums, which I'd like to mention. And I did
Yeah.
have a brief discussion of these with Jennifer Doudna when she gave a talk here. Um, she's very aware of them. The the main issue is, do you try to do genetic engineering on the germline or on the adult organism or on the complete organism? If you're doing it on the germline, then you can do it in a petri dish. You can use artificial reproductive techniques. You can genetically transform an oocyte and fertilize it and implant it in an embryo. And that would fix a particular genetic problem. Now, it fixes it for all time in the sense that then any children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren that modified genome has are all going to have that genetic transformation. Now,
Right.
let's go back to life history evolution. Remember, there is a trade-off between reproduction and survival, or reproduction and maintenance. If the thing that we have fixed was designed to reduce the risk of a disease that occurs at old age, the chances are very good that what we have done is we've also reduced the reproductive capacity of that organism when it will be younger.
Right.
And that's the kind of negative surprise that you don't like to have. Okay, now let me go back and let's just go back to another kind of genetic therapy, which is called somatic gene therapy. And that is when you take some kind of transformation vector, often it's imagined as being some kind of virus, and you ask it to go into every cell of the adult body and transform the adult cells. And of course, you could do this after reproduction. So people could go ahead and have a good reproduction, and then you could go in at the age of, say, 45 or something like that and do your genetic transformation on the adult organism. Sounds great, but there are about 10 trillion cells in the adult organism. And you got to get that vector into all 10, well, most of the 10 trillion to have this work. So it is much more technically difficult to do that. And it would have to be redone in every generation. Now, let me point out that, in fact, NIH has started to do something like this, and it's very exciting, and I think in that case it will work. And those are the clinical trials that they've done to genetically transform the blood cells, the bone marrow cells of people who have sickle cell anemia. And sickle cell is really a nasty condition. It's a classical trade-off. People who inherit that are resistant to malaria, but 1/4 of their children, or percentage of their children, depending on who they marry, are going to have a trait that results in very, very deformed red blood cells. That's why it's called sickle cell. And if you're no longer living in an area that has a lot of malaria, this is just simply totally bad. There isn't any redeeming feature to it because you don't need to resist malaria. So the first woman who actually had this basically had her bone marrow cells wiped out by chemical therapy. And then they took her bone marrow cells and transformed them so that they wouldn't have the sickling gene, and then they grew those up and reimplanted them in her. And it was a kind of a harrowing therapy to have this done to you, but I saw her interviewed on 60 Minutes after it was done, and she was looking so good and she was feeling so much better. So, I think in a case like that, where there's just a clear downside and you're doing it to an adult, you're not doing it to the germline, I think there's no downside to that. I think that's a very good application of genetic engineering in humans.
Right. Yeah, so we will take a quick break, Steve, and then we'll come back. We will talk about a couple of your other papers as well.
Very good.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.
So we are back. Steve, so the paper that we were discussing, I want to touch on another area. You call it adaptive responses to modernity. And you say the second question we asked was whether natural selection has started to alter human responses to recent environmental changes. And I was just wondering, when we were talking before, the decline in reproduction rates that we have seen most of Western Europe and Japan, is that conscious, or is that sort of a response to us living longer?
Oh, I think it's both, but I don't think it's genetic. I think that what's happened is that humans are now, I think in the past we had encountered a lot of different kinds of environments, and we had built into our genomes information how to respond flexibly to different sorts of environments. And so part of this reaction that you're seeing is biologically based rather than conscious, and part of it is due to the fact that we have evolved flexible responses to the environments that we're exposed to. But part of it is certainly conscious. And I think that the conscious part often is connected to feelings of insecurity about who's going to take care of me in old age. And if the traditional way of doing that was to have children and to have vertically integrated families living together, and so that the kids would take care of their parents when their parents got old, and when that's no longer true and the nuclear family is broken down, if the state is then replacing that safety net with an adequate kind of security for old age, and that gets out there as something that's consciously understood, then the whole behavior pattern can shift. You don't need kids to take care of you in old age, and so how badly do you want them just for the sake of having them while they're growing up? And I think a lot of people change their decision structure based on that.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the loss or decline in reproduction rate seem to be higher in countries with universal healthcare and more egalitarian systems compared to more competitive, sort of without a lot of protections underneath for people. Is that relationship fairly strong? I'm thinking about, Scandinavia and Japan compared to, let's say, the US.
Well, I have that impression, but I want to caution you, I'm not really an expert on that part of it. I think that someone who is a health economist or someone someone more like Amartya Sen or someone like that would really understand those relationships in much more detail than I do. But boy, I sure have that impression. Yes.
Right. So you have a term here called opportunity for selection. And you want to take that and break that into two components: juvenile mortality and variation in adult fertility. So what are the implications of those two things?
Okay, let's go back and just talk about a bit about how natural selection actually works as a mechanism.
Yeah.
It is all based on variation among individuals in their birth rates and death rates. So some people may have many more children than others, whereas other people may have inherently stronger constitutions than others and survive better. And it is that variation in these important, what we call vital rates or demographic rates, that actually drives natural selection. And if there were not variation in those things, then natural selection could not occur. In other words, if everybody had exactly the same number of children and everyone all died at 71 or something like that,
right.
Natural selection would not work. So when we say opportunity for selection, what we're saying is, how much variation is there in those rates? And when we ask how much do they actually contribute to the number of offspring per person per lifetime, that can come either through survival or it can come through reproduction. And so we break it down into a survival component and into a reproduction component. And what we've seen is that as we go through the demographic and epidemiological transition, survival rates are getting better and better. Mortality rates are dropping and dropping. So it means that there's less variation in the survival component.
Right.
But if I'm giving a talk on this and I'm looking out at a room of 500 people, and I ask, okay, how many of you come from families that had one child? Hold up your hands. How many came from families that had two children? Hold up your hands. And I go on up.
Yeah.
And what you see is that hands are going up for families of all different sizes, even though we're now in a post-transition society in which survival rates are very good. What that means is that there is still a lot of variation out there in reproductive rates. Some people have a lot of kids and some people have few kids. Everybody's surviving pretty well, but some of them are having a lot of kids and some are having a few kids. And that means that the mechanism of selection is now being driven much more by variation in reproduction than by variation in survival.
Right. Yeah. So, certain countries like China, for example, had a forced a policy, like how many kids one could have. I think it had it in place for a period of time. I wonder what the implications of a policy like that might be.
Yeah, by the way, it was a policy that was only for the 300 million richest people in the country. The poor people in the countryside didn't have to obey it. However, most of my Chinese students at Yale are products of that policy.
Okay. And so I guess it's pretty rich data to possibly look at what the effects of something like that might be, right? It's not natural, but it's forced.
It is forced, and it had some tragic consequences as well. There were incentives in Chinese society to have sons rather than daughters, and when it became a real forced zero-sum game, then and widespread ultrasound diagnosis of the sex of offspring was available, it resulted in the sex-specific abortion of girls. And so there is something that's kind of famous in demographic circles, which is called the female deficit in China. And it basically is how many, as a result of this policy, how many girls did not get born. And the answer is in the tens to possibly hundreds of millions. So it really created a perverse incentive and some consequences that were not very pretty. And I think that will happen. By the way, there's something like that in India as well.
Right.
And it really depends upon whether the culture is based on dowry or on bride price, right? And so basically what happens is that people have an incentive to select the sex of their offspring that will give greater economic gain at marriage.
Yeah, it's a net present value problem.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think you were actually aiming at something else when you asked me that. In other words, did China shut off natural selection?
Right, exactly. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it might be too short an experiment to really get to it, but it seems like a massive experiment, right? So might be some interesting data.
There might be, but believe me, public health people have always had difficulty getting reliable data out of China.
Right.
And
Yeah.
if it were like Iceland, where they're very reliable, and if you buy it or you buy into it or you cooperate with them, you get your hands on really detailed, reliable data. China is not like that. China pushes all of its demographic and public health data through a political filter.
Right. Yeah, so you closed this paper with two major recommendations. You want to talk about them, or you want me to? So the first one, you say, first, mismatches between past adaptations and current environment are a major theme in evolutionary medicine, but we do not yet have accurate estimates of the timing or most of the signature of selection.
Right. So
Yeah.
one of the things that we know is that we can go into any human population and we can find correlational evidence that shows that genes have effects on two or more traits, and that things that are beneficial early in life are often correlated with things that are detrimental late in life. But we do not have accurate estimates of whether or not those early effects are just generally early, or whether they end at age 35 or at age 40 or age 45 or age 50. And at what age the risks start to increase, I think we have a much better idea of that, because people have been quite worried about the death from cancer or the onset of Alzheimer's and things like that.
Right.
So we have a much better estimate of the time course of the negative effects late in life than we do of the beneficial effects early in life. And if we actually want to be able to understand what some of our genetic interventions might do, we really have to understand those time courses.
Yeah, I going back to the CRISPR conversation, Steve, we could conceive a situation that you have an option at birth, which direction you want to head, whether you want to optimize the early period or later period. because we probably have technology for that, not too far into the future.
Well, we have technology to change genes, but what we don't have is an understanding of how the organism is built. That's that's the black box. It's very complicated because genes don't map into traits directly. They work through genetic networks, which are complicated and which contain many possibilities for compensation and for indirect effects. So if we really want to claim that we are in a position to act as engineers of an airplane where we know all the things that are happening in the airplane, well, as far as the human body, we are a very long way from that because bodies are not actually causally determined in the way that an airplane is. We're not machines with replaceable parts. We are organically integrated, and we're organically integrated with levels that interact with each other within cells, among organ systems. Lots of different levels. So all I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, it's complex and we need to be modest. And I don't think that we're going to be able to do what you just said in the near-term future. In other words, we won't be able to decide, oh, I want to live a short, happy life and leave a beautiful corpse, or live a long, rewarding life, but maybe not have too many babies.
That's right.
It's going to be hard to genetically engineer that dichotomy.
Okay. So that'll keep it interesting, at least for a while. The second recommendation you have, we need large multi-generational prospective cohort studies that allow direct measurements of genetic variation, selection intensity for common traits in contemporary populations. So this is not something that we systematically study, right? You're bringing this up as areas that require further studies, and without data, we can't really go any further.
Well, the reason for that recommendation is that a number of evolutionary biologists like myself happened upon a few large-scale cohort studies like the Framingham study or the Swedish twin study, or there's a big study in the UK, there's another one in Australia. However, each one of those studies was designed by a group of physicians and public health experts to look at one particular problem. And now we have a huge imbalance in our data. We have the ability to rapidly get the complete genomes of tens of thousands of humans sequenced. So we have incredible detail on the genes. But we don't have the same level of detail on the phenotypes, by which I mean all of the important traits that these humans have. And we would have enormous power to do detailed scientific studies that would include causation if we could get equivalent detail on the phenotypes. Just imagine, we have information on 3 billion different nucleotide locations in the human genome for tens of thousands of human beings. But the average big cohort study has been recording information on perhaps 50 or 60 traits. So it's 50 or 60 on the one hand versus 3 billion on the other hand. And that's a huge imbalance in the kind of information we have about, oh, this is what the organism looks like, and this is what its genes look like. We need to bring that back into balance. If we could bring that back into balance, we would learn a tremendous amount, not only about the influence of genes on organisms, but on the way that genes interact with environments in the process through which organisms are built. And that's actually the way that we all have developed. We've all developed by interacting with different kinds of environments, and our genomes contain information that's contingent. It says if you're developing in this environment, do this, but if you're developing in this other environment, do this other thing. And we don't know what all of those rules are. If we manage to discover them, imagine what a redefinition we will have for doctors to say, what's your definition of a patient? Your patient really is this entire developmental history. And your patient really is a big collection of traits that are trading off with each other. And some of them are studied by cardiologists, and some of them are studied by pediatricians, and some of them are studied by oncologists. But nature doesn't care about your medical specialties. It's presenting you with a patient that's integrating across all those systems. And,
Right. Yeah.
and if we could get that picture, and it's probably a picture that can really only be held by a computer, but we're getting much, much better about asking computers to tell us what's going on. I think
Right.
that we would have a much better understanding of not only our health, but also an understanding of our ongoing evolutionary potential.
Right. Right. Yeah. So you have been working on in this area a long time, Steve. And so, in conclusion, if you look forward, let's say 5-10 years, based on your work and your colleagues, where do you think we will see sort of the biggest, I shouldn't call it improvements, but sort of biggest insights and changes that might happen in this area in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I see them more in evolutionary medicine than they do in life history evolution, because I think life history evolution is an area that's attracted a lot of very bright people. And there are a lot of people who've been working hard at it now for several decades. And I think that many of the important insights are already kind of recognized as important insights, and their consequences are being explored. In evolutionary medicine, it's different, because the medical profession has not really taken evolution on board as a source of insight, and it's starting to recognize it. And I would say that the areas where it's already had impact are in the problems that arise when we get the evolution of antibiotic resistance, and we can no longer treat bacterial infections with established antibiotics, and in things like cancer, because every cancer is its own independent evolutionary process. It's a competition between competing clones within a cancerous lineage. And my goodness, if you go into the cancer literature now, that is so widely recognized that I find cancer biologists reinventing the evolutionary wheel. We just read a paper for my course in evolutionary medicine today, in which the people who were reconstructing, using phylogenetic techniques to reconstruct the history of metastases in a human body, had rediscovered the problem that neutral evolution actually produces branches, and that if you want to claim that something is selected, that you have to allow for the fact that, well, a lot of stuff is going to happen neutrally without selection anyway, and so that's sort of the background expectation you have to have. This is a problem that was confronted by evolutionary biologists back in the 1980s, and pretty well worked out. The cancer biologists, not having had that training, are going back and they're discovering that it's an issue, and they're cautioning each other about it, and they're kind of reinventing that wheel. There are only a few people who are actually trained evolutionary biologists that are operating within the framework of cancer research. Jeff Townsend, whom we've interviewed, is one of them. And Jeff really understands this problem in depth. But I look at some of these papers that these folks are writing, and I'm thinking, my goodness, we could have saved ourselves a lot of time if we had just given these people a good background in evolutionary genetics when they were undergraduates, because now they're encountering problems in cancer evolution where they need that background, and they're reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, I mean, the beauty there is, I think talked to Jeff about this too, is that because if you look at one individual and one individual's disease, that has its own properties, but it is a fairly contained system. So you can, if you have the heuristics, reasonably well understood, you could have some predictions. You can get ahead of the evolutionary sequence of the cancer cell potentially. So there's a lot of implications, I think, for treatment.
Oh yeah, I think there are. So I think the answer to your question is yes. We will see, I think, interesting breakthroughs in cancer therapy that are driven by fundamentally evolutionary insights. And I think that people like Jeff are probably going to be partially leading that charge. However, I would like to mention another thing, and that is that if we apply life history thinking to the design of the human organism, and we ask, can we come up with a theory of the organism? Can we really come up with a way of saying these are design principles, and this is how we would predict changes to occur? Ruslan Mechitov is starting to make some real progress in thinking about that. And he writes concept papers for Science and Cell and other major journals at fairly regular intervals. And one of them that came out in 2019 applied life history principles to understanding the way that the immune system, the reproductive system, the endocrine system interact with each other. And I think that in so doing, he has begun to lay the groundwork for a whole different way of thinking about what is an organism and therefore really what is physiology, what is biochemistry, how do they interact with each other, and why are they designed the way that they are, and what are the constraints that they place on design. And I think that that's a level of integration of biology that we are going to see in the 21st century that will pay off in the long run, because it's really very fundamental, and it gets at the whole issue of, well, gosh, what is an organism and how should I think about it?
Yeah, so, this is happening everywhere, Steve. Most of the innovation potential is at the intersection of fields, right? So when you go into a field and you do a deep dive in a very narrow specialization, there is a lot to be done there. There's a lot to be learned. But the innovation potential is actually at the boundaries of fields. And I strongly believe that it has some implications for how education systems are designed as well for the future. Because unless we do that, I believe the innovation growth will decline, even if we have very high knowledgeable specialists in very specific areas. Pharmaceutical companies, for instance, has this problem now in many
Well, I can
areas.
tell you one story. I have a very bright student from Beijing. She's a single daughter, and she started off being a biomedical engineer, but she took my course on life history evolution and then noticed that I'd already written a book on evolutionary medicine, and so she decided to switch into evolution and ecology from biomedical engineering. But my goodness, what a combination of backgrounds that woman has. She has chemistry, she has physics, she has computer science, she has statistics, she has evolutionary thinking, she has good understanding of physiological systems. If we can educate more people like that, we can just stand back and be amazed and surprised at what kinds of ideas they'll come up with.
Absolutely. Yeah, excellent. This has been great, Steve. Thanks so much for spending time with me. And good luck with this research.
Thank you. Take care, Gil. Right, bye.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.